When 73-year-old veteran Marcus Webb placed his morning bowl of raw meat beside the old banyan tree for the 1,000th time, he had no idea that in 3 weeks he would be gone, and that his death would reveal a bond so profound it would move an entire Indian village to tears and change how the world sees wild creatures forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus Webb never intended to spend his retirement years in the remote village of Chandrapur, nestled deep in the forests of Maharashtra, India. After serving 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 decades as a military engineer, he had planned to return to his childhood home in Ohio, maybe buy a small farm, live quietly with his memories and his pension. But life, as Marcus had learned through years of war and loss, rarely follows the plans we make. In 2018, at the age of 68, Marcus received news that shattered what remained of his American dreams. His only son, David, a wildlife photographer, had been killed in a car accident while documenting tigers in central India. The local authorities had David's equipment, his final photographs, and his ashes waiting to be claimed. Marcus flew to India for what he thought would be a brief, painful trip to collect his son's belongings and say goodbye. But when Marcus arrived in Chandrapur, something unexpected happened. The village residents, who had known and loved David during his 6 months documenting their local wildlife, embraced the grieving father with such warmth and genuine care that Marcus found himself unable to leave. David had been documenting the human-wildlife conflict in the region, focusing particularly on the increasing encounters between leopards and villagers as development encroached on natural habitats. "Your son was different," explained Priya Sharma, the village schoolteacher who had helped David with translations and local knowledge. "He didn't just take pictures. He listened to our stories, learned our struggles, and showed the world that we and the animals are all trying to survive together." Through tear-filled conversations with David's local friends, Marcus learned that his son had been working on a project about a particular leopard, a large male with distinctive scarring across his left shoulder, who had been regularly spotted near the village outskirts. Unable to face returning to an empty house in Ohio, and drawn by the connection to his son's final work, Marcus made an impulsive decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He used David's remaining research funds to rent a small cottage on the edge of Chandrapur village, telling himself he would stay just long enough to finish David's documentation project. That was 5 years ago. The cottage sat on 2 acres of scrubland that bordered the Tadoba National Park buffer zone, exactly where David had set up his final photography blind. The property came with a caretaker's shed, a small vegetable garden, and most importantly, a clear view of the animal trails that crisscrossed between the village and the deep forest. Marcus spent his first weeks in India sorting through David's photographs, journals, and video footage, trying to piece together his son's final project. It was while reviewing David's notes that Marcus first learned about the scarred leopard his son had been tracking. David had named him Shadow, and had documented over 40 sightings across 8 months. The notes revealed David's growing fascination with Shadow's unusual behavior. Unlike most leopards, who avoid human settlements, Shadow seemed curious about the village, often sitting at the forest edge just watching the daily activities of the residents. Marcus's first encounter with Shadow happened on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 2 months after his arrival in Chandrapur. He had been sitting on his small porch, drinking tea and reading David's field notes, when movement in his peripheral vision made him look up. There, not 50 meters away, sat the most magnificent leopard Marcus had ever seen. The animal's golden coat was dappled with morning sunlight filtering through the trees, and across his powerful left shoulder, Marcus could clearly see the distinctive scarring that David had photographed so many times. For nearly 10 minutes, man and leopard regarded each other in complete silence. Shadow showed no signs of aggression or fear, simply sat with the patient stillness that only wildcats possess, his amber eyes fixed on Marcus with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. When Shadow finally rose and melted back into the forest with fluid grace, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since David's death, a sense of connection, of purpose beyond his grief. That night, Marcus made a decision that would define the remaining years of his life. He drove his motorcycle to the village market and purchased 5 pounds of fresh goat meat from Ravi Patel, the local butcher who had supplied meat for David's photography bait. "You continuing your son's work?" Ravi asked in his careful English. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what work he was continuing. The next morning, Marcus placed a portion of the meat on a flat rock near the banyan tree where he had first spotted Shadow. He then retreated to his porch and waited. For 3 days, the meat remained untouched, attracting only flies and the occasional crow. Marcus began to feel foolish, wondering if he was simply a grieving old man projecting meaning onto random wildlife encounters. On the 4th morning, the meat was gone. Fresh leopard tracks in the soft earth around the banyan tree confirmed what Marcus hoped. Shadow had accepted the offering. From that day forward, Marcus established a routine that would continue without interruption for the next 5 years. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., he would carry a bowl of fresh meat to the banyan tree, place it carefully on the flat rock, and then return to his porch to wait and watch. Initially, Shadow remained cautious, approaching the food only after Marcus had retreated a considerable distance and waiting until he thought the human was no longer watching. But gradually, over weeks and then months, the leopard's behavior began to change. Shadow started arriving earlier, sometimes even before Marcus had finished placing the food. The distance between them slowly decreased as mutual trust developed. The villagers initially thought Marcus had lost his mind. "Sahib," warned Jagdish Kumar, the village elder, "feeding wild leopards is dangerous. They lose their fear of humans. They become problem animals." But Marcus continued his daily ritual, driven by something deeper than logic. A sense that he was maintaining not just Shadow's trust, but somehow continuing his son's interrupted work, honoring David's belief that humans and wildlife could coexist if only they took time to understand each other. By the 6th month of their daily encounters, something extraordinary began to happen. Shadow started arriving before Marcus even left his cottage. The leopard would position himself near the banyan tree at dawn, sitting in patient silence until he heard the familiar sound of Marcus's screen door opening. This routine became so predictable that Marcus found himself setting his alarm earlier, not wanting to keep his wild friend waiting. The breakthrough moment came on a humid morning in April when the pre-monsoon heat was already oppressive by sunrise. Marcus had been suffering from a mild fever and moved more slowly than usual as he carried the morning meal to the banyan tree. As he bent to place the bowl on the rock, his arthritic knees buckled slightly, causing him to stumble forward. Instead of bolting at this sudden movement, Shadow took 3 deliberate steps closer, his head tilted with what Marcus could only interpret as concern. For the first time, they were close enough that Marcus could hear Shadow's breathing, could see the individual whiskers twitching as the leopard scented the air between them. Marcus remained perfectly still, crouched beside the food bowl, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment of unprecedented trust. Shadow approached until only 10 feet separated them, his golden eyes never leaving Marcus's face, and then did something that took Marcus's breath away. He sat down, lowered himself to the ground in a relaxed position, and began to eat while Marcus watched. From that day forward, their relationship transformed from cautious feeding routine to something that resembled companionship. Shadow would arrive at dawn and wait patiently while Marcus prepared the meal, often vocalizing with soft chuffs that David's research notes had identified as leopard expressions of contentment. Marcus began talking to Shadow during these morning sessions, sharing stories about David, about his years in the military, about the loneliness that had driven him halfway around the world to find purpose again. "You probably knew, my son," Marcus would say as Shadow methodically consumed his breakfast. "David wrote about you constantly, said you were the most intelligent leopard he'd ever observed." Shadow would pause his eating to look directly at Marcus during these conversations, his ears forward, as if truly listening. Whether leopards could understand human emotion or not, Marcus felt certain that Shadow somehow grasped the significance of their daily meetings. The villagers' attitudes began to shift as word spread about the American veteran and his remarkable relationship with the scarred leopard. Children would peek around corners to catch glimpses of Shadow during feeding time, their eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. Priya Sharma started bringing her camera to document what she called the miracle of the banyan tree, and her photographs began attracting attention from wildlife researchers across India. Dr. Anita Desai, a leopard behavior specialist from the Wildlife Institute of India, arrived in Chandrapur after seeing Priya's photographs online. She spent 2 weeks observing Marcus and Shadow's interactions, taking notes and recording videos with barely concealed amazement. "In 30 years of studying leopard behavior," she told Marcus, "I have never witnessed anything like this." Shadow is displaying social behaviors that we typically only see between leopards and their cubs, or occasionally between mated pairs. He has essentially adopted you into his social structure. Marcus's cottage became an unofficial research station as Dr. Desai set up motion-activated cameras around the property to document Shadow's movements throughout the day. The footage revealed that Shadow's relationship with Marcus extended far beyond the morning feeding sessions. The leopard had claimed the area around Marcus's cottage as part of his territory, regularly patrolling the perimeter during the night, scent marking the boundaries, and positioning himself where he could observe the cottage while remaining hidden in the forest. "He's protecting you," Dr. Desai explained while reviewing footage of Shadow driving off a pack of wild dogs that had approached the cottage one night. "This behavior is completely unprecedented. He's treating you as family, as something valuable that needs defending." The implications were staggering. A wild leopard had chosen to expand his natural social behavior to include a human being, not out of dependence or domestication, but as an equal partner in an interspecies friendship. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As their second year together began, Marcus noticed that Shadow had started bringing him gifts. Not the typical prey offerings that cats might bring to their owners, but carefully selected objects from the forest, unusually shaped stones, interesting pieces of bark, once even a perfect bird's feather placed delicately beside the food bowl. Marcus began collecting these offerings in a small wooden box on his porch, treasures from a world he could never fully enter but had somehow been granted limited access to through Shadow's trust. The daily routine expanded beyond feeding as Shadow grew more comfortable with Marcus's presence in his territory. The leopard would sometimes linger after eating, grooming himself while Marcus tended to his small garden or repaired equipment on the porch. On several occasions, Shadow followed Marcus during his evening walks along the forest edge, maintaining a parallel path through the trees, visible only as occasional golden flashes between the branches. Marcus's health began to decline gradually during his fourth year in Chandrapur. The tropical climate, combined with his age and the lingering effects of chemical exposure during his military service, took an increasing toll on his body. His morning walks became shorter, his movements slower, but his commitment to Shadow never wavered. Even on days when fever kept him bedridden until afternoon, Marcus would force himself to maintain the 6:30 a.m. feeding schedule, knowing that Shadow would be waiting by the banyan tree. The villagers, who had initially viewed Marcus as an eccentric foreigner, now regarded him as a local treasure. Ravi Patel refused to accept payment for the meat, considering it an honor to support the legendary friendship. The village children had composed songs about Shadow Sahib and his leopard friend, and visiting researchers from around the world made pilgrimages to witness the extraordinary bond that had developed between species. Dr. Desai published her findings in multiple international journals, but she always emphasized that the relationship between Marcus and Shadow transcended scientific explanation. "What we're witnessing," she wrote, "challenges our fundamental understanding of wild animal behavior and the possibilities for peaceful coexistence between humans and apex predators." Marcus's health deteriorated more rapidly during the monsoon season of his fifth year in Chandrapur. The humid air aggravated his breathing problems, and the arthritis in his joints became so severe that some mornings he could barely lift the heavy bowl of meat. But even when his hands shook with pain and exhaustion, even when the village doctor, Dr. Mehta, urged him to rest, Marcus refused to break the sacred routine that had defined his life for nearly 2,000 consecutive days. Shadow seemed to sense the changes in his human friend. The leopard began arriving earlier each morning, sometimes sitting vigil outside Marcus's cottage from 5 a.m. onwards, his amber eyes fixed on the door, as if willing the old man to emerge. When Marcus finally appeared, moving more slowly than usual, Shadow would approach closer than ever before, occasionally even allowing their paths to cross as Marcus made his way to the banyan tree. The leopard's behavior became increasingly protective, positioning himself between Marcus and the forest during feeding time, scanning the tree line with heightened alertness. The first serious health scare came on a Tuesday in August, when Marcus collapsed while returning from the morning feeding. Shadow, who had been following at his usual distance, witnessed the fall and did something that left the entire village talking for weeks. Instead of disappearing into the forest as any wild animal would when confronted with human distress, Shadow approached Marcus's motionless form and began making loud, urgent vocalizations. a sound that Dr. Desai later described as a leopard distress call, the same vocalization mothers use when their cubs are in danger. Priya Sharma, who had been walking to school, heard Shadow's calls and discovered Marcus unconscious on the path. She later swore that Shadow remained beside Marcus until she arrived, only retreating when human help was clearly present. The leopard then positioned himself in the nearby bushes, watching as villagers carried Marcus back to his cottage, his eyes never leaving the procession until Marcus disappeared safely inside. Dr. Mehta diagnosed severe dehydration and exhaustion, prescribing bed rest and threatening to call Marcus's distant relatives in America if he didn't take better care of himself. But Marcus's primary concern wasn't his own health, it was Shadow's routine. "He'll be waiting tomorrow morning," Marcus told Priya weakly from his bed. "He doesn't understand why I'm not there." Priya assured him that she would handle the feeding, but Marcus shook his head with surprising firmness. "He won't take food from you. He only trusts me." Marcus was proven correct. For 3 days while he recovered, various villagers attempted to maintain the feeding schedule, but Shadow refused to approach the banyan tree when anyone other than Marcus was present. The leopard would arrive at dawn, sit at the forest edge, and wait for hours, his calls becoming increasingly agitated as the morning progressed. The untouched meat attracted other scavengers, creating chaos that disrupted the entire forest ecosystem around the village. On the 4th day, against Dr. Mehta's strict orders, Marcus dragged himself from bed and made the journey to the banyan tree, supported by a walking stick that Jagdish Kumar had carved for him. Shadow's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The leopard approached within 5 feet, closer than he had ever come, and began making the rumbling vocalizations that Dr. Desai had identified as expressions of intense relief and joy. For several minutes, leopard and man simply regarded each other, and Marcus swore he could see tears in Shadow's golden eyes. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship, but also highlighted the fundamental problem that both Marcus and the observing researchers had been avoiding. Shadow had become completely dependent on their daily interactions, structuring his entire territorial behavior around Marcus's presence. Dr. Desai's camera footage revealed that Shadow spent increasingly long periods each day in the vicinity of Marcus's cottage, neglecting normal leopard activities like hunting and territorial patrol. The leopard was slowly losing his wild independence, becoming psychologically bonded to a human whose life was clearly nearing its end. "This is unprecedented territory," Dr. Desai confided to Priya during one of her research visits. "We're witnessing the formation of an interspecies attachment that has no parallel in wildlife literature." But Marcus is 73 years old, and Shadow is entering his prime adult years. What happens when Marcus is no longer here? Shadow has never learned to maintain normal leopard social patterns. He's essentially become psychologically dependent on a relationship that cannot be permanent. The question haunted Marcus during his sleepless nights as his health continued to decline. He had come to India to escape the pain of losing his son, and in saving Shadow from the loneliness of being a solitary predator, he had inadvertently created a new tragedy. The leopard who had given his life meaning for 5 years was now facing the same devastating loss that Marcus himself had experienced when David died. Marcus began researching leopard lifespans and behavioral patterns, trying to understand what Shadow's life might look like after their relationship ended. Wild leopards typically live 12 to 15 years, meaning Shadow was likely in his mid-prime, with potentially a decade of life ahead of him. But Dr. Desai's behavioral assessments suggested that Shadow had lost many of the skills and instincts necessary for independent survival. The leopard no longer hunted regularly, relying instead on Marcus's daily provisions. He had abandoned normal territorial behaviors, focusing his entire range around the cottage, rather than maintaining the larger territory typical of adult male leopards. Most troubling of all, Shadow showed no interest in mating. During the previous mating season, camera traps had recorded 3 different female leopards passing through his territory, but Shadow ignored their scent marks and vocalizations, remaining fixated on his daily routine with Marcus. Dr. Desai worried that Shadow was sacrificing his natural leopard identity for the sake of their unusual friendship, a sacrifice that would leave him completely isolated when Marcus was gone. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily on Marcus's mind as his physical condition worsened. He had nightmares about Shadow, waiting by the banyan tree long after Marcus was dead, growing thin and desperate as he called for a friend who would never return. The very relationship that had saved both of them from loneliness was now threatening Shadow's future survival, and Marcus felt powerless to solve the dilemma he had unknowingly created. Marcus knew his time was running short when he could no longer make the walk to the banyan tree without stopping to rest 3 times along the 100-meter path. His breathing had become labored, his appetite had disappeared, and most mornings he woke, feeling like he was drowning in his own body. But Shadow still waited at dawn, and Marcus still struggled to maintain their sacred routine, even as each day became more difficult than the last. On what would be their final morning together, Marcus moved so slowly that Shadow broke his usual pattern and approached the cottage itself, something he had never done in 5 years. The leopard sat directly outside Marcus's door and began making soft chuffing sounds, almost as if he was calling Marcus to come out. When Marcus finally emerged, carrying the food bowl with trembling hands, Shadow walked beside him step by step to the banyan tree, matching the old man's faltering pace. As Marcus placed the bowl on the familiar rock, his legs gave out completely. He sank to the ground beside the banyan tree, his back against the massive trunk, breathing heavily but strangely at peace. Shadow approached closer than he ever had before, settling himself just 3 feet away, close enough that Marcus could see the intricate pattern of his spotted coat, close enough to hear the leopard's steady breathing. They sat together in the morning silence, 2 old friends who had found each other across impossible circumstances. "I'm sorry, Shadow," Marcus whispered. "I won't be able to feed you tomorrow." The leopard's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and those intelligent amber eyes seemed to hold understanding. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter he had written weeks earlier, weighted down with a small stone. With his last burst of energy, he placed it beside the food bowl. Then Marcus Webb closed his eyes beneath the banyan tree, where he had found purpose again, and quietly passed away with his unlikely friend keeping vigil beside him. Shadow remained by Marcus's body for 18 hours, refusing to leave even when the villagers discovered them the next morning. The leopard had positioned himself protectively over Marcus, and when Dr. Mehta and others approached, Shadow made it clear through low growls and defensive posturing that no one was to disturb his friend. It took Priya Sharma reading Marcus's letter aloud for Shadow to finally step back, as if he somehow understood that the words were meant for him. The letter, written in Marcus's careful handwriting, contained detailed instructions for Shadow's care and a revelation that stunned everyone. Marcus had secretly been working with Dr. Desai and international wildlife organizations to establish the first-ever human-wildlife bond sanctuary on a 50-acre plot of land adjacent to Tadoba National Park. Using his military pension, David's life insurance money, and donations from researchers who had studied his relationship with Shadow, Marcus had purchased the land and begun construction of a facility designed specifically for animals like Shadow, wild creatures who had formed deep bonds with humans but could never be fully domesticated. But Marcus's most extraordinary gift to Shadow was still to come. The sanctuary's centerpiece was an exact replica of Marcus's cottage and the banyan tree, constructed in the middle of the protected territory. Marcus had arranged for a local veterinarian, Dr. Kavita Rao, to continue the daily feeding routine at the replica tree, maintaining Shadow's established pattern while slowly encouraging him to explore his expanded territory and develop more natural behaviors. The transition was heartbreaking to witness. For the first month, Shadow would sit by the new banyan tree during feeding time, but wouldn't approach the food until Dr. Rao had left. He would eat quickly and then spend hours at the cottage replica, as if waiting for Marcus to emerge. Camera traps recorded Shadow making distress calls each morning at 6:30 a.m., the exact time of their former routine. But gradually something miraculous began to happen. The sanctuary's larger territory awakened Shadow's dormant leopard instincts. He began patrolling borders, scent marking trees, and even started hunting small prey to supplement his daily feedings. Dr. Desai documented his progressive return to natural behaviors, while noting that he maintained certain unique traits from his years with Marcus, a tolerance for human presence that made him invaluable for educational programs, and a gentleness that defied everything science knew about wild leopard temperament. The most remarkable development came 18 months after Marcus's death. Shadow, now fully integrated into his expanded territory, encountered a young female leopard who had wandered into the sanctuary. Instead of the aggressive territorial response typical of male leopards, Shadow displayed the patient, gentle behavior he had learned from Marcus. The female, later named Luna by the sanctuary staff, stayed, and within 2 years they had produced cubs, the first leopards ever born to a father who had been raised with human companionship. Dr. Desai's continued research revealed that Shadow was teaching his cubs a unique combination of wild leopard skills and the human tolerance behaviors he had learned from Marcus. The cubs could hunt and survive independently, but they also showed none of the typical fear aggression toward humans that made conservation work so dangerous. They represented a new possibility for human-wildlife coexistence that researchers had never imagined possible. The Marcus Webb Human-Wildlife Bond Sanctuary became a pilgrimage site for conservationists, animal behaviorists, and anyone seeking to understand the profound connections possible between species. Shadow, now a father and the sanctuary's most famous resident, continued to visit the replica cottage daily, though his stays grew shorter as his family responsibilities increased. Visitors would often see him sitting beneath the banyan tree at sunset, and longtime observers swore they could see him looking toward the sky, as if acknowledging the old soldier who had given him the gift of trust. Marcus's story and Shadow's ongoing legacy challenged everything the scientific community thought they knew about wild animal behavior, human-wildlife conflict, and the possibilities for peaceful coexistence. The sanctuary he established became a model replicated in conservation areas worldwide, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the simplest acts of compassion. Today, Shadow is the father of 12 cubs and grandfather to 6 more, all bearing his unique combination of wild independence and human tolerance. The leopard, who once depended entirely on an old veteran's daily kindness, has become the foundation of a new approach to conservation, one built on mutual respect rather than fear. Marcus Webb found his son's work in the forests of India, but in saving Shadow, he created something even more lasting, proof that love truly knows no boundaries between species. What do you think about this incredible story of friendship that transcended species? Have you ever experienced an unexpected bond with a wild animal? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that show the amazing connections possible between humans and the natural world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring tales that remind us we're all part of one interconnected family on this planet. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.